National Broadcasting Company, in cooperation with the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization, and the Educational Television and Radio Center, presents 10 for Survival, a series dedicated to man in the nuclear age. Today's program, Radiation and the Body. Your host, Frank Blair, sitting in for Chet Huntley.
A few weeks ago, a small news item came over the wires from Japan. Perhaps not many people noted it. The item told briefly of a citizen of Hiroshima who died as a direct result of exposure to radiation during the atomic bombing of that city. This man was the 26th individual to have died this year as an after effect of that bombing, a bombing that took place 13 years ago. The casualty list of Hiroshima is still mounting. The cause of this man's death is, to the general public, a little understood, and therefore all the more terrifying menace: the effects of radiation in a nuclear explosion. Last week, if you were with us, you learned some hard facts about radiation, how it is formed, how it behaves. Certainly, it's not a comforting subject, but our object is not to comfort, but to inform. The idea that something undetectable by any of the senses can kill is a horrifying one. Yet, that is precisely what radiation, as well as a number of deadly chemicals, can do. There are ways, however, to recognize the symptoms of radiation sickness, to protect yourself against excessive exposure, and to minimize at least some of the dangers. To do so, of course, requires some basic knowledge. Armed with that knowledge, you may be among the survivors of an all-out nuclear attack. Without it, you and your family will be counted as victims. To help us in our quest for this knowledge, we've invited here one of the world authorities on the biological effects of radiation. He is Dr. Shields Warren, professor of pathology at Harvard. Dr. Warren, last week we were introduced to the Roentgen as a unit to measure the amount of radiation being received. How many Roentgens are considered dangerous to the human body?
Well, right here, Mr. Blair, we should make a simple fact clear. All radiation, of whatever degree, is harmful to living cells. An individual cell may receive a dose of radiation which is not large enough to kill it, but that doesn't mean that no harm has been done. Think of it this way. The cells that make up our body have a life cycle all their own. They are born, they die, just as we ourselves do, except that this life cycle of the cell may cover a period of days to years. The cell which received the radiation, we agree, did not die, but was merely damaged. It passes this damage on to its descendants over a course of several generations. Let's say that after 20 years, a deformed or crippled cell is then produced, which is a direct result of that initial injury. So you can see that no matter how trivial the initial radiation dose, a harmful effect can be produced.
But what about the deliberate exposure of people to large doses of radiation in the treatment of cancer, for instance?
Radiation is used in fighting malignant growths because the very destructive effects we've been discussing. If we are attacking malignant cells somewhere inside the body, we focus the rays on that part of the body so that only the cells that we want to destroy receive the full dosage. But for the purposes of this discussion, we're interested in what we call whole body radiation exposure, not in these carefully controlled and highly localized types.
Well, from what you've just said, Dr. Warren, it seems to me that it would be wise to avoid all exposure to whole-body radiation, no matter how slight.
I agree. It would be desirable indeed if such a thing were possible. Unfortunately, It is not. All of us, no matter where we live or what we do, receive a certain amount of radiation exposure over the course of our lives. Natural background radiation is part of the makeup of our universe. We receive some of it from rocks and stones, some from cosmic rays filtering through our protective envelope of atmosphere.
But we're exposed to other sources of radiation in our lives, aren't we?
Yes, indeed. Medical radiation from X-rays, fluoroscopes, and so forth account for some 20% more than the natural radiation.
What about fallout from nuclear tests?
That amounts to only about 5% of the natural background radiation at the present level of testing. And all these exposures to radiation combined amount to less than what has been called permissible exposure to radiation.
But if any exposure to radiation is harmful, how can scientists arrive at a permissible level?
I'm afraid permissible is a relative term. Since we cannot avoid some radiation, we naturally want to know how much we can receive without serious expectancy of some detectable injury. The level of exposure has been set at 5 roentgens per year of whole body radiation for the duration of a person's adult lifetime. Furthermore, this permissible dose does not take into account long-term genetic effects, possible injury to our descendants.
I see. Then we're talking about a permissible whole body exposure of less than 3/100ths of a Roentgen per week. Now that seems awfully small. How many Roentgens could you expect to receive shortly after a nuclear explosion?
4,000 per day would be a nominal figure for a person unfortunate enough to be in a so-called hot area following an explosion. That's more than 100,000 times the permissible dose, and needless to say, would be lethal.
Well, how many Roentgens could a person receive and still hope to live?
To answer that, we must differentiate between the immediate effects, the long-range effects, and the genetic effects of radiation. The science of genetics is, of course, a relatively new and very complex thing. For our purposes, we can limit ourselves to a few broad statements about the genetic effects of radiation. It is known that radiation produces mutations. Of course, mutations are sudden changes in the physical or mental characteristics of our descendants. And as far as we know, all such mutations are harmful. For that reason, a person who receives acute or chronic radiation before he's past the breeding age may have harmful changes to his or her germ cells that may bring about harmful changes in some descendants.
But what about other long-range effects from an acute dose of radiation?
Well, there are many of them. For example, an individual lifespan may be shortened because the aging processes are speeded up.
What about the possible marked increase in the development of other physical things? I've heard about such things as eye cataracts, leukemia. What about those, doctor?
That is true. There is also an increase in these, but heartless as it sounds, Mr. Blair, in a wartime situation, we're much more concerned with the immediate effects. If we don't survive them, the other and more remote effects are merely of academic interest.
Well, I can understand that, but about these immediate effects, can we put some kind of positive values to them so that we'll know a little more about what we're up against?
Well, let's find out. First, you must realize that the effects of radiation will vary somewhat with individuals because of their age, their general physical condition, and other factors. With that in mind, let's take a situation where a group of individuals receive an acute exposure of 300 Roentgens, 450 Roentgens, and 600 Roentgens. These are doses, incidentally, to which a large proportion of the population would be exposed in event of a nuclear attack. We have a chart here which indicates 6 categories of physical fitness. Here on top, we have an individual with enough reserve energy to undertake a 10-mile hike. In short, a person in good physical condition. Next in order, a person able to undertake a normal workload. Next, we have a person in a state of lassitude. He becomes easily fatigued and is able to work for short periods only. A little lower on the scale, we find a person who is ill but still well enough to take care of himself, although not able to do any work at all. Another step lower on the scale, we find a person too ill to take care of himself. And finally, on the lowest point, we have death. Now, here on the bottom of our chart, we have periods of days 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, clear up to 1,000, or about 3 years. Now, let's find out what can be expected to happen to a group of people who receive an acute dose of 300 Roentgens. Within a day of receiving the exposure, they are drained of the reserve energy and suffer lassitude and fatigue. They quickly recuperate, and after 4 or 5 days, they find they've recovered enough to do work. But then a serious relapse sets in. After a period of about 3 weeks, they're pretty sick. Although most of them are then able to take care of themselves, a few, about 10%, do not rally but continue to decline and die. The other 90%, however, recover and rally sharply. Within a period of 2 months, they will have their reserve energy back and, at least to all purposes, are completely normal again. Now let's examine the second case. Those who receive an acute dose of 450 Roentgens. The reaction under 1 day is illness mild enough to permit self-help, as in the previous case. They rally somewhat, but not nearly as much as the others did. The relapse sets in at about the same time, 5 days or so from exposure. But this time they sink much lower and become dependent patients from 8 to 10 days. At this critical point, about half the people could be expected to decline rapidly and to die. The other half would begin a slow recovery, and after some 4 months would be back at the point where they can resume normal work, although may never recover their reserve energy. But remember, these are only 50% of the total effective. The rest have died. Finally, let's take the case of an acute exposure of 600 Roentgens. They become dependent persons on the first day of exposure, do not rally, and continue to decline until by about the end of 2 weeks, 90% are dead. After the 3rd week, about 10% have some degree of recovery, and by the end of 2 months, these survivors should be well enough to take care of themselves. After 7 months, they can resume working, even though they probably never recover their normal reserve injury. But again, remember that this group represents only about 1 out of every 10 receiving the 100 Roentgen exposure.
Well, from that graphic illustration, Dr. Warren, I gather that an acute exposure of 400 to 450 Roentgens would be considered an average lethal dose.
That is the figure usually agreed upon, yes. But as I warn you, the results vary with individuals. About 1 in 10 could be expected to die from an exposure of 300 Roentgens.
That raises a point I'm a little hazy on. Are these doses cumulative, or does it mean, when you say an acute dose, that you receive all 300 Roentgens at one time?
Many people are confused by this point, Mr. Blair. Perhaps I'd better explain that we express exposure to radiation in terms of dose rates. That is, if the dose rate were 3,000 Roentgens per hour, and you were to be exposed for 6 minutes, 1/10 of an hour, you would have received an acute dose of 300 Roentgens. If you subsequently received no further exposure at all, 300 Roentgens would be your total exposure. You could reasonably expect to survive such an exposure and recover in a period of about 2 months, but probably your life would have been shortened by a year or more, and you're vulnerable to many long-range effects.
But suppose a person received 30 Roentgens on one day, 30 on the next, and so on for 10 days for a total of 300 Roentgens. Would the damage be as great as though he received the 300 Roentgens all at one time?
Over a period of 10 days, the total immediate damage in most cases would be about the same. But let's extend the period of exposure to a month. If you received a total of 300 Roentgens over a month, fairly evenly distributed, you would not necessarily be incapacitated for even a short time. The body has a chance then to fight back and recuperate from the attack. But there is a catch. The long-range effects of such a continued exposure would be as great as in the case of acute exposure.
But in the event of a nuclear attack, Dr. Warren, it seems to me that the problem would be not a single large exposure, but a continuing exposure over a period of time.
That's quite true, and we do need some sort of rule of thumb as to the amount of exposure we can take over a continued period of time. We might set these maximum exposures in tabular form this way.
Then, if you never receive more than 100 Roentgens in one day, if your total for any 1 week is under 150, and your total exposure over a month's time is 300 Roentgens, you will probably survive.
Well, bearing in mind that we're dealing with conditions of extreme emergency, that's true. Although 300 Roentgens should also be considered the lifetime exposure of the individual in question. In other words, he should never be exposed to acute doses of radiation again.
Well, now, if you cannot see radiation, or smell it, or feel it, how can an individual under attack know whether or not he's been irradiated?
I'm sure that some experts might quarrel with these figures that I just quoted, but they are true in general. This question of yours that you just raised presents quite a problem, and it is compounded by the fact that for a long time, the survivors of a bombing would probably be without any outside medical aid of any kind. In the first weeks of a post-nuclear attack, every person would probably have to act as his own physician. For that reason, he must be able to recognize the symptoms of radiation sickness. One of the earliest symptoms of a relatively lethal dose of radiation is vomiting. A person will definitely begin to vomit within a few hours or a day of receiving a lethal dose. If he does not, the chances are excellent that he's not received a lethal dose. Other symptoms include a feeling of lassitude, prolonged bleeding from trivial cuts, bleeding from the gums, loss of hair, diarrhea, and inability to heal wounds.
It seems to me, then, that many of these symptoms are exactly like the symptoms found among many victims of disaster that have nothing to do with radiation sickness.
Well, yes, that's true, and it presents a very definite problem for the amateur diagnostician. About the best he can do is to remember that the symptoms of disaster sickness tend to disappear, while in radiation sickness, a relapse occurs after a week's time.
Doctor, in other words, if there's no relapse, you can breathe easier. But, well, now, how about the disease itself? Can anything be done to cure a person of radiation sickness?
No, the damage caused by radiation is partly irreversible. It cannot be entirely undone. There are, of course, certain measures that can be taken. Complete rest to speed up the replacement of the damaged cells is indicated. So is shelter from further radiation from the elements. Care to avoid injury and infection is most important. Blood plasma often speeds the recovery period, and proper nutrition is likewise helpful.
What about the so-called radiation pills? Isn't something being done in the laboratories along that line?
While a great deal of experimental work is being done on radiation protection, there's nothing that acts to protect over a long period of time.
The answer, then, is to shield yourself from radiation as much as possible under any circumstance.
Yes, Mr. Blair, that is the most desirable of all preventative measures, even under the worst imaginable conditions. The one object of every individual should be to take measures to receive as few Roentgens and to keep his exposure time as short as possible.
But you'll have to eat food in order to stay alive. How can a person eat when all available food stocks have been contaminated.
Well, that's another aspect of radiation that is very little understood by the general public. The fact that gamma rays have penetrated a piece of food does not render that food inedible. That doesn't mean that you can't eat food on which radioactive particles have fallen, because if you did, you would introduce those particles into your body, which could prove fatal, however, if the particles could be removed from the surface of the food, you would find it completely unharmed. As a matter of fact, we've set up a demonstration which will clearly illustrate this point. This is Howard Forbes, the director of the Eastern Instructor Training Center of the OCDM. Will you take over, Howard?
Thank you. This is a Geiger counter type instrument, which could be used in monitoring contaminated and exposed foods. The noise you hear and the needle movement is caused by the normal background that the doctor was speaking of a moment ago. We have here a contaminated banana. And as you can see, the needle has increased and the noise increase has occurred. The fruit, however, may still be edible if, with care, handling, we assure that we do not get our fingers or the radiated peel on the fruit. We may find that the fruit itself is quite edible, and of course, this is still radioactive, but the fruit has no appreciable radiation above the normal background. And, of course, is edible. Would you care for some banana, Doctor?
Sure. Let's have a piece.
You fellas know what you're doing, so I'll go along with you.
We might also point out that radiation cannot be deteriorated or materially affected by fire. This ashtray is not contaminated, nor is the tissue. However, through the burning process, we can establish...
You're contaminating it now.
Trying to contaminate the burning tissue, we will find that the fire has had no effect at all, for the radiation is quite high, though the tissue has been burned.
I see. Well, so much for a banana, which was contaminated on the outside, but not on the inside. Now, what about a food that one may come in contact with that itself is contaminated? Can contaminated foods be taken?
Through careful monitoring, foods that are contaminated to a small degree could be ingested with no material effect, with a lot of care. I have in my hand a food and water comparison source and some peanut butter here that is contaminated. And by a careful evaluation of the intensity here, which runs approximately 12,000
That's
counts,
a lot of racket.
we can go to the peanut butter, which has only around 2,000 counts, and establish that since it is approximately 1/6 the amount of the source, and the source is established for 10-day ingestion, we could probably eat foods contaminated to this extent for a period up to 60 days before we would have to convert to non-contaminated foods.
Well, this has been a very dramatic demonstration. I hope there are no after effects from the banana, gentlemen.
I shouldn't worry about it. Bananas are notoriously easy to digest.
Well, any food that had a covering or wrapping, Doctor, would be safe once that wrapping is removed. What about a loaf of bread and waxed paper?
Perfectly safe once the wrapping is removed and discarded, and such foods as tomatoes and apples can be rendered safe by careful washing. So you see, protected food is not a particular problem as far as radiation goes.
But I can see one serious problem. You say that some foods would have to be washed, such as tomatoes and apples. What about the water in which they're washed? Let's say, what about drinking water, which is a general topic?
That could very well offer some more serious problems. Water from deep-covered wells or water actually in pipes at the time of fallout would be quite safe from radioactive material. Water in open reservoirs might be a different matter if, by the time it reached you, radioactive material had fallen into it. It could be very harmful. But if I were trying to stay alive under the emergency conditions of a nuclear attack, I would certainly take my chances on drinking a small amount of such water if there were no other sources of water available. Be really a height of folly to let yourself die of thirst for fear of being irradiated by contaminated water. That is the nature of all decisions that will have to be made in the event we find ourselves in such a situation.
Yes, a matter of first things first. Is that it, Doctor?
Yes. And in a peacetime atmosphere, it can sound rather ruthless. For example, if a group of people have to be exposed to radiation in order to get a vital job done, the workers should be selected from those who are past the breeding age so that harmful genetic effects will not be a factor. There will also be situations where rescuers will have to risk radiation. Hard as it may seem, the lightly injured may have to receive priority over those who have no chance of ultimate survival.
Well, it all sounds very grim and very ominous to me, Doctor.
I agree, Mr. Blair, but we can't make it any more pleasant by refusing to look at it. The truth is, if we are willing to face reality, if we're willing to take the trouble to learn a few bits of rudimentary information, then we are well on our way to ensuring our personal survival in the event of a nuclear war.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shields. Dr. Shields Warren, I should say. Dr. Warren is professor of pathology at Harvard. And we've been trying to make clear a few of the biological and medical facts of radiation. I would like to call to your attention that due to because of the far-reaching importance of the facts we've been discussing, we have prepared a booklet in cooperation with OCDM on the menace of radiation in nuclear war, along with specific measures for defense that every citizen can take. Now, you may have a copy of this free booklet by writing for it, and this is the address: 10 for Survival, Box CD, Battle Creek, Michigan. Again, that's 10 for Survival, Box CD, Battle Creek, Michigan. Last week we discussed some of the physical aspects of radiation and fallout. Next week, Chet Huntley will return to take up the all-important matter of protecting against radiation and fallout. Dr. Lauriston Taylor of the United States Bureau of Standards will pay a return visit to bring a great deal of information and some very practical advice that could very well spell the difference between your own personal life and death. I urge you not to miss it. Until then, goodbye.
Executive producer for 10 for Survival, Malcolm McGregor. Produced by Joel O'Brien. Directed by Linwood King. Written by William Welch. Our guests today were Dr. Shields Warren, professor of pathology, Harvard Medical School, and Howard D. Forbes, director, Eastern Instructor Training Center of the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization. "10 for Survival" was produced for the Office of Civil and Defense Mobilization and the Educational Television and Radio Center. This has been an NBC production. This is National Educational Television.